and then we will keep going. Right, so this is where we should be. If I just scroll through, just double check that you're in there. Right, I'll remove the old ones. You don't need the old ones. Couple of seconds, sorry. Right. Now we know who's in. Now, where we last left off in our adventures discovering and discussing the ideas of income and decisions households make with regards to employment and consumption, essentially, and income. We've got these two models. Now, in your exam, there is a chance, in fact, quite a strong chance, because it's one of your key skills, that you're going to need to do some analysis of data. Now, whether that is data in a table or whether it is data in a graph varies based on the year, right? So it might be that you get presented with a graph like this and you get asked to explain what is happening in the graph, right? Now, that's quite a good one to explain because kind of the title hints at what's actually going on. However, a word of caution with regards to that is it's actually got numbers, explained because kind of the title hints at what's actually going on. However, a word of caution with regards to that is it's actually got numbers, as you see. Now, one of the rules that I say for learners is in your exams, if the examiner has gone to the trouble to include a case study, then they're expecting you to talk about that specific case study. And if they've gone to the trouble to include actual numbers, then they're wanting you to include numbers in your explanation as to what's going on. So you might talk here about the actual earnings impact on, in this case, different genders, male versus female, and talk here about what the impact is over time on the basis of their earnings, right? So it is showing a drop in women's income after having children, right? That's what this is attempting to show, and you can then use the percentages to demonstrate that. This one, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It's talking about how your income changes over time, and we mentioned that the other day, right? How your income starts, right, rises quite sharply, right? Over time, you start to see your income plateauing, but there is a period of time when you are going to be able to save quite a bit of income, and that's really good. Then, eventually, you reach a certain point where you are going to end up retiring, potentially, and it doesn't have to be at 65. It could be at 70. It'll be at 40, dependent on what you plan for, right? And then once that happens, then your income disappears and you end up using your savings in order to live. So again, that's the sort of discussion that could then be used as an analysis in an exam. It could be a multiple choice, in which case the answer would be there. Excuse me. Or it could be in your paper 2, and you have to actually explain using perhaps the numbers, etc., that are inside. So let's take a little bit more of an in-depth look at how you actually get the income. How is it that employers decide who to employ and why, right? Quite an important understanding, as you'd see. Now, it all comes back to a model that we've seen before. It's the market model, but this is a labour market model, right? So slightly different terminology. And we're going to break it down into demand and supply. So the very first part of it, because we remember demand and supply, that's what's going to determine the wages that you're able to earn. But in this instance, when we talk about the demand for labour, we're not talking about us. We're talking about the businesses. The businesses demand us as workers. We are a factor of production. We are the labour in land, labour, capital, enterprise. That's us. Okay? So therefore, the businesses are going to demand more factors of production, one of which might be labour. Why would they do that? Well, the term here that we use is derived demand. That doesn't mean the type of demand that you get when you go for a derived. That's a different thing, right? This particular context, the derived demand talks about the demand for the factors of production, specifically labor, but doesn't have to be, when there is an increase in demand for the products. So if there's an increase in demand for hats, then you would expect to see an increase in demand for the people who make the hats. Okay, that's how that works. So if there's an increase in demand for computers, you'd expect to see an increase in demand for the people who make the computers. Increase in demand for iPhones, you'd expect to see an increase in demand for the people who make the iPhones. Hello, Lancelot, how are you? You're doing well? Good to hear. Fantastic. All right, so that's what demand for labor is. It's the business demanding workers based on the demand for the product that they're producing. And on a bigger scale, on an economy-wide scale, you could talk about the total demand, right, in the whole economy. So if there is more demand for everything in the economy, then you're going to need more workers for pretty much every industry, right? So the total demand for goods and services in an economy. And the term that we use for that total demand is this idea of aggregate demand. Aggregate, which is a fancy word for total, and also a word for cement, by the way, just in case you're wondering. All right? Aggregate, a fancy word for total demand in the entire economy from a macro point of view. If there's more of that, then there's more demand for the workers. Yeah, that's kind of how that one works. However, we do need to consider why they are demanding workers. And there are several things to consider, one of which is productivity, how good the workers are at doing the task that we want them to do. All right. So say, for example, you've got someone who is an expert in this particular field. They're the best there is at whatever it is. You want that person in your team, in your business. So you're going to pay them whatever it costs to potentially get them in your team, business. Okay. So a classic example, the other night, Steph Curry hit some three-point shots, and he is now officially the second best three-point shooter in the history of the NBA. All right, that's pretty remarkable that happened. And as a result of that, you can then see why it is that he is paid the amount that he is, because there is that demand for him and his services in that particular sport, in basketball. But it could be a specialist in healthcare, a doctor. It could be a specialist in the computing world, right? A specialist engineer who builds particular things, space engineers who build the spaceships. They're very specialist, they're very productive, potentially they could do lots of different things, and so there might be more demand for them. Okay? And likewise, the cost of labor, how expensive labor is. Now, it might be that you think, oh, that shouldn't matter, right? But it quite often does, particularly if you're thinking skill sets which aren't perhaps as productive, but, you know, more everyday type of skill sets, yeah? A classic case study that we saw, we were in China for a few years, and there were some big businesses there, quite big businesses, some of which you will know of. And at one point, right near where when we were leaving, those businesses decided to leave China. They packed up their entire factory and just left. And the reason why they did that was because the cost of labor, even in China, was becoming too expensive for those businesses. So they then relocated those businesses to other countries like Sri Lanka and Vietnam, Cambodia, you know, a few other countries where perhaps the cost of labor was a little bit less. Right? It was quite interesting because some of those factories were just down the road from where our school was, so we would actually drive past them quite a bit, and all of a sudden, they're gone. So productivity of labor is a very big influence, obviously derived demand, so demand, productivity of labor, and then of course how expensive labor is. Now it is a market model, so we have a demand curve. There it is, downward sloping. Now there is quite a lot to this, and again you can grab that from the slides, whack it into your notes, it's there. Right? The idea here is that this is a demand curve just like any other. Okay? However, it's a bit different because it's about a factor of production. and it's a bit different because it's about labour, it's about us. So you can imagine some perhaps quite unusual demand curves based on the job that there is, okay? And the individuals and how productive they are. Essentially, though, when we look at it, the more productive the person is, the more likely they are to be hired, and the more likely they are to be hired first, right? They are also the ones who are going to be able to command a higher wage, okay? Because they might be the better qualified person, perhaps, in that particular job. We tend to say that from a business point of view, if the wages are higher, the cost is higher, so there will be a contraction of quantities demanded. So you move up the demand curve that way. However, if the wages are falling, if they're lower, then we tend to see an expansion of the quantity demanded along that way. Okay? That's just like a normal demand curve, an expansion and a contraction. It's just that we're talking about people. We're talking about labour. That's what we're doing. Now, thinking about the supply is a bit different because the supply is actually us. So here's where you ask questions about you, right? What would make you supply your labour? Okay. Is there a wage rate at which you'd say, yeah, I'll work for that? Or conversely, a wage rate where you'd say, yeah, no, I wouldn't work for that, okay? So when we look at this, several key indicators are determining the quantities of labour that are available. The first one being the actual number of people that there are. Right, that's quite important. If you don't have the number of people of working age, so kind of thinking about 15 on up, right? Because below 15, we're kind of thinking that you're not necessarily going to be working. Society determines that if you're under the age of 15, you probably aren't working. At least in a lot of economies, not in every economy, I'm going to admit that. And definitely in the past, if you were young, you were just a small person, a small adult. So it was considered that you would go and work as well. So you'd be working, you know, the little people going up the chimney to clean the chimney. Yeah. Remember this idea of being a teenager is a new invention, right? It came about in the 1960s, 1970s. Before that, you were just a child and then an adult. Yeah, this idea of a teenager is more of a marketing construct, you know, than anything else. Okay, so then we consider this idea here that people have to be willing and able to supply their labour. So if they're not able, if they cannot physically do the jobs, if they can't work at all physically, then they're not in that particular group. Right? They're just not going to supply their labour. And similarly, if they're not willing to, now you're talking your desire. If you just want to sit on the couch and watch TV, you're not willing to go and get a job, then you're not in that pool of people either. Okay, so those two things are going to have an influence over the supply of labour that's available. Now, it might be that all of a sudden lots of people just decide they're not willing. Nah, don't want to do it. Just going to sit at home. Okay, and one of the things that determines that is this bit. The idea of welfare payments, the idea that the government can give you money if you're unemployed. Because what we don't want is we don't want to have a whole lot of people unemployed who can't afford to live. Obviously, at the moment, we've got, you know, a global pandemic and economic crisis happening around the world. But what we don't want to have is a lot of unemployed people living under bridges, whatever, okay, not able to cope with themselves and their life and their families and all of those sorts of things. So the government in many parts of the world provides something called welfare, or an unemployment benefit, or a payment for those individuals, right, if they're unemployed, so that they have money to buy food, so they have money to pay their rent. Well, the problem with doing that, and that's a good thing to do, but the problem with doing that is that it might actually influence how many people are then willing to work. Because if you're getting an income, and this has occurred in some countries, the UK being an example, New Zealand being another, where they are paid, some individuals have been paid an amount of welfare and decided, well, government's going to pay, I might as well just not work and just take that money and sit on the couch and watch TV. And that did become a problem, okay? And to the extent where there are some, in some cases, not in every case, but in some cases there are entire generations that haven't worked, ever, right? Grandparents, parents, children, none of them, right? Because they've been able to receive a welfare payment and they've been just at home. So the idea of willing and able to work, influenced by this idea of availability of welfare. The next thing is this idea of a changing social climate. That's us again, that's society and what we value. So we might say, no, we want the children to go up the chimneys to clean the chimneys. Yeah, we might want that, yes. Get the children in work, come on, all right? Or we might say, no, that's not what society values. That's not what we want. I mean, you know, for yourself, you probably would prefer, I'm going to say, to be at school than to having to be going and doing a job to earn money for your family. I'm just going to say, all right? Whereas in some parts of the world, it's no, you've reached an age, now you're off, you've got to earn money, we've got to have money for the family, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Or conversely to that, and this is the one that's mentioned here, is women working, right, in the workforce. Because it wasn't always the case, right? If you go all the way back, I say all the way back, if you're talking about the 1940s, right, even the 1950s, which isn't that long ago, believe me, right? Even back then, what you find is that there will be a large number of families where it is only the male of the family who works in a traditional workplace. That it was considered women would be at home raising the family. And maybe that's a decision that still gets made, but quite often women will be out working now. Society has decided that that is what will happen. So then there is more people willing to work, so a bigger pool of people able to work, right? Now, interestingly enough, if you're wanting to know when that sort of psychology shifted, it is around the 40s and 50s, 1940 and 1950s, because you had the Second World War. And during the Second World War, all the men were off fighting, and there were a whole lot of jobs available, and nobody doing them. So they ended up encouraging the women to take the jobs. Sounds wrong the way I said that, right? To have jobs, to work in the factories, etc. And after that time, it was like, well, goodness me, we never thought this would happen, but women can actually work. Wow, what a surprise, yeah? So therefore, that can be something that can be considered with regards to the availability of workers, the supply of workers. And there are still countries where you can look at the percentage of women in the workforce and say, yeah, there's only 20% of women in the workforce, or 40%, or 50%. And you can actually look at that and say what it is. I mean, look at America, right? Look at how challenging it was for a woman to rise to power in America. And yet there are a number of other countries around the world, mine included, where we've had female prime ministers often. In fact, in New Zealand, we've got one right now. Right? We've got female mayors, female prime ministers, right? We've got female CEOs, but it's taken until now, right? It's just this year that there's a female coach of an NBA team, yeah? And a female coach now of a NFL team in America. So it's taking a while for that particular glass ceiling to break. Right. Then there's this idea here about geographical mobility. Now that's exactly as sounds. Mobility, the ability to move. But geography is ability to move place. Some people might need to move to a different region within the country to get a job. How easy is it to do that? Right? Maybe it's easy, maybe it's not easy. Some countries are a lot bigger. So the actual idea of traveling to, you know, another part of the country to get a job is a lot bigger a decision to make than just, you know, popping down the road sort of idea. Oh, look, there's a job across the road. Let's go there. Yeah. All right. Classic case is America. If you have a look at some of those small towns in America where maybe the entire industry is gone, right, unemployed, and as a result of that, there's a whole lot of people without jobs. Well, surely they should just move somewhere to get a job, but where? And how do they do that? You know, they might have a family to look after. Right? All of those sorts of things. But it's not just necessarily within a country. It might be internationally. Now, obviously, at the moment, there's not a lot of the international travel happening. But, I mean, you consider us as international teachers. We moved. Right? We moved from New Zealand all the way to China, yeah? And that was considered a huge move. And in New Zealand, people thought we were crazy. Yeah. And then we went from China to Thailand, and then from Thailand here to Malaysia, right? So we've moved around. But we were able to do that. Geographically, we were able to do those moves. Not everybody can. Obviously, at the moment, people aren't. But what if your passport says you're not allowed to go to certain countries? Yeah. What if, and that's true for some people, what if the rules and regulations of that country say you can't come here because you're a certain age or something else, right? Something we are considering as well. Yeah, we have to consider too. This one here, occupational mobility. Again, it's that same idea about being mobile, being able to move, but in this case, it's about being able to move within an occupation. Fancy word for job, right? So if you are in a job, right, you're in the job now, what happens if they suddenly ask you to also do this task? Can you do that? What if now you're not able to do that part of the job, but you're able to do this job instead? So they move you into this team to do that job. Yeah? Right? Are you able to do that? How many people can take the skill set that they have and work in different fields within one particular industry? So say, for example, you decide to become a doctor, a medical doctor. Well, there are a whole range of different specialisms within that career path. And it might be that they don't need you in that particular field, but they need you in this. So you've got to then shift into that. Yeah. So if you take me as an example, right, I can be an example here. I've worked in a number of jobs. So it's not just within one industry. It could be changing complete industries. Yeah. I worked in a supermarket for a number of years. Yeah. So the change from that to then, as I did go and teach at the university for a bit, right, was a big change, yeah? And then the change from there to go into teaching was another big change. And then, of course, I've been teaching in different schools in New Zealand and obviously internationally, and that's a change as well. So being occupationally mobile. But even within teaching, it might be, or classic case again with me, in New Zealand, there's not as big a demand for economics, right? So quite often there's more demand for business. So I have actually taught business before, okay? In New Zealand, they don't teach what are called the humanities. They teach something called social studies, which is the New Zealand version of the humanities. So I have actually taught geography and history as well. In New Zealand, again, because there wasn't a lot of demand for economics always, I've actually also taught, and secret squirrel, right? I've actually also taught junior maths. Shh, don't tell anyone, right? Not going to do that again. No. Right? So that meant I was able to teach junior maths, which worked out to be, the equivalent of up to about year 10 maths. So it would be year 7, 8, 9, 10 sort of maths. That level of maths, nothing higher than that. Yeah. And of course, if you look at my qualifications, the degrees that I have, and the individual aspects of those, in theory, the school could decide, well, because of your qualifications, you could teach business. Because of your qualifications, you could teach English. Because of your qualifications, you could teach media studies. Because of your qualifications. So being mobile within an occupation, right? So able to have different skill sets that fit different areas of a job, but also potentially able to move from one job to a completely new one. Can people do that? Is that possible? And the more we need that has an impact on the supply of labor as well. Now, the future of work, and we've discussed a little bit of that, is going to be more about occupational mobility. We've got the internet now, so now geographic mobility just means as long as you've got an internet connection, you can do a job most often. Look, here we are doing it, yeah? But occupational mobility, encouraging everybody to have as broad a skill set as is possible so that they're then able to possibly do this job and that job and this job, or some combination of them, right? So all of those are going to be determinants of the supply of labor. Now, terminology time, here it is. Now, this one is a new concept, something we need to learn, and you can be asked about this in a calculation way. They can actually ask you in multiple choice, so to calculate this, or they can ask you with regards to explaining it and what it means and how you use it in the paper too. So labour force participation rate is the term that we use. Relatively straightforward in a lot of regards. It's the labour force, it's the people in that labour market, right? Participation, that means are they involved? Are they actually working in that labour force? So it is the percentage, because it's a rate, the percentage of individuals from the working age population that are working rather than are unemployed. Are they participating? Are they trying? Are they working? Yeah? In that particular economy. And it could be about, because you could actually split this up and you could say, let's look at the labour force participation rate of women. Let's look at the labour force participation rate of men. Let's look at the labour force participation rate of women between the ages of this and this. Let's look at the labour force participation rate of this particular ethnic group, all right, this age, this gender. So you can be really quite specific with what it is that you're looking at. So people who do the studying of this, right, they're going to be narrowing it down to one specific field perhaps and trying to work out what impacts there are on different groups within society with regards to the supply of labour. Now this is usually influenced by several key points, 4 of them. First one being the idea about full-time working versus part-time working. Now, this can actually hide a lot of information because when people say they have a job, they don't often tell you whether it's a part-time job or a full-time job. And the more familiar you are with work and the like, the more you'll likely see that people can have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, 4 jobs, right? Dependent on whether they are full-time or part-time. And if you're in America, I mean, obviously at the moment, yeah, okay, there were people who had up to 5 part-time jobs just trying to make ends meet, just trying to earn enough money so that they had food on the table and were able to pay their rent. Okay? Now, with the pandemic, you're seeing people losing some of those part-time jobs, possibly not all, which means that their income is decreasing. But when you see the statistics coming out from America, like hundreds of thousands of people unemployed, sometimes you need to take a little bit of a step and say, are they full-time workers or part-time workers? Because it could be the same people, just multiple part-time jobs. Or it could be they're all full-time work and goodness me, yeah? And again, it could be the number of people in the workforce itself, the different groups, again, within society. How many women are there in the workforce? If we talked about participation rates, that's something to consider as well. That's an influencing factor. The next one was age distribution of the workforce. So if you've been to different countries around the world, and you might have, you may have come across a country called Japan. Right? It's a real country. It's out there somewhere, right? And Japan, if you haven't been there, and you might want to go in the future, right? You might want to go there. You will notice that a lot of the people there are older. You will find a surprisingly few, little, not many, amount of people who are younger in Japan. Lots of older people, okay? So many so it's actually become a problem because of this very idea. That once those people reach a certain age and start retiring, who then is going to be working underneath them to support the economy, right? So Japan is one of those countries that's quite desperate to actually import people, right? They're wanting people to come in, occupationally, geographically mobile people to come in to work because their labour force is actually shrinking as it gets older. So the age distribution of the workforce. And here, you just look around here. If you've been to any of the shop, again, not at the moment, but if you've been to the shopping malls, you'll notice that there's like 2, 3, 4, 5 children being pushed in prams around the place, yeah? And that's something that happens. And then you see that grows the amount of possible labour that there could be in the labour force, you know, because of the age distribution. And then the last point there is the retirement age. Now, there isn't necessarily a set age that the government says you have to retire. But quite often, there are other rules and regulations around retirement that encourage people to retire at particular ages. So 65 is a classic age, because in some parts of the world, New Zealand being one of them, when you retire, you're able to earn a retirement income called superannuation from the government. Okay? And that benefit, that unemployment, if you will, but retirement income, okay, only kicks in at the age of 65. In fact, I think it's increasing now. I think they're pushing it up to about 67. Right? And in other parts of the world, it might be, they might have a similar system and it might be a similar age. So for a lot of people, then the decision about when to retire might be based on their superannuation, when they think they will be receiving an income from the government. But it might be that people on average retire at 70 in that particular country. As we've said already, current president of the United States, President Biden, which does feel good to say, right? He's actually the oldest person ever to be elected president in the United States, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. And if Bernie Sanders had gotten in, he would then be the oldest person, yeah? And if Donald Trump had had another turn, then he would be the oldest, okay? So they're all in their 70s, right? Some of the US senators are actually in their 80s, and they're still working, right? And again, if you have a look around the world, you will see actors. Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's in his 70s, he's still been acting in movies. Musicians, Sir Paul McCartney is well into his late 70s now, and he is still recording music. So retiring is at a set age is perhaps a little bit different and a bit more flexible than what we might think according to the theory. Supply is a weird one because it's you and me. It's our decisions about supplying. It's willingness and ability. So if we're able, excellent. But what makes us willing, right? Now, maybe it's the wages that make us willing. So the wage rises and let's get in, let's get a job. Yeah, let's work more. But to what extent? Yeah, if the employer was to come to you and say to you, we would like you to work more hours, but we will pay you more wages. To what extent would you be happy doing that? Yeah? Oh, you already work 40 hours, now we'd like you to work 50 hours, but we will pay you this much more. You already work 50 hours, if you work 60 hours, we'll pay you this much more. Where does it end? Yeah. So where does your willingness change, right? If they're offering you thousands and thousands of dollars, but you have to work 70 hours a week, do you then say, whoa, I need some time? Yeah. Because think about your friends, your family. Yeah. Again, at the moment, you're probably seeing more of your family than you might want to, right? But quite often, if it's school-based time, you look forward to the holidays, because in the holidays, you get to see and hang out with your friends. Well, if you're working 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week, 80 hours a week, how much time are you actually going to have to see your friends and family? So modern economists have come up with this idea. It's called a backward bending supply curve for labour, with the idea being that as your hours of work increase, it doesn't matter realistically about the wage. What matters is your willingness, right? At some point, you're going to start saying, actually, no, I want to reduce the hours that I'm working because I'd like to spend more time with my friends and my family. That time is quite precious. Again, I used the case study before about Japan. Again, if you don't know, it's a real country. It is. Oh, it's just up there. And in Japan, one of the things that they have had to change is they've had a culture within the country of overworking, where they will just work all these different hours and just keep working and working and working and working. Okay, the culture, I don't know when it came about, but it's been around for a long time. It was the idea that you had to get to work before your boss. Okay, otherwise, oh dear, you're not seen to be a good worker. You had to stay at work longer than your boss. Otherwise, again, oh dear, you're not seen as being a good worker. Okay. Which meant that people were spending longer and longer and longer and longer and longer at work. Didn't mean they were more productive, by the way. It just meant that they were spending a lot of time at work. In fact, and this is a scary statistic for you, not a statistic, a scary fact for you, in Japan, there's actually a word in a category on death certificates of death by overwork. I know, frightening, but it is. There are people who actually die at work. Scary, right? But the idea being is that they're working so hard and they're old that they quite literally die at work. And for some, and I know this is sounding really crazy, but it is true, for a while that was seen again as a good thing in Japan, because that showed commitment to the team and the business. Now, they are working at trying to change that. There are a few cultural things within that they're trying to unpack. But the idea here, as said, is that at a certain point, you, the supplier of labour, are going to want to reduce the hours that you work in order to spend time with friends and family. Yeah. I mean, teachers, you know, how accessible are we? Well, it's the internet age. You can send us an email at any time. I've had emails from students at 2 and 3 in the morning. Well, I'm not going to be replying to them at 2 and 3 in the morning, but I know that those emails have come through at that time. Yeah. So how much time should I be at work? What is my on time and my off time? What is my time with my family? What is my time with work? You know, those sorts of ideas. And you all have similar, right? I mean, you'll be at home, maybe mum and dad are at home with you as well, and they're trying to do their job from home, but also balance it with a family, yeah? So how do you sort that sort of thing out? And it might be this idea here. How many hours are you willing to supply?
Mr. David?
Yeah.
Can you even, would it be the same if I said I am willing to work or I need to work? Because, for example, in other countries where, they're poorer and stuff, they are obligated to work because then their families will die of hunger or whatever.
Yes.
Would that be the same thing? Same.
Yeah, in that case, yes, you're absolutely right. In different sets of circumstances, the supply for labour will be different. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There may not be a backward bend at all. It may just be that people keep working and working and working because they have to. You're absolutely right. Well done. Right. This is a very Western-centric idea that may actually not match reality in many parts of the world, where workers have to keep working and they will work every hour that there is in order to earn income for their family. And we saw that as well. We were again in China, and what we would see is that workers would be, born in the country, and then they would get on a bus and go all the way into the city to work in the factory. But they would actually live basically either in the factory or next door to the factory, and they would work all hours every day, 7 days a week to manufacture the products, and they wouldn't go back home, but they might send the money back home. Yeah, so that's what they would do. Okay, and yes, we have seen the factories with accommodation outside them, and they'd have netting outside the windows in case the workers got so depressed because they were working so much and they're away from their family that they decided to, right, and then the net would catch them. Yeah, so we have seen that. Okay, we have had a number of people that we have known where that has actually been the case, who have been working at the school that we were in, and where is your family? And family is all the way in the country. They don't actually see them at all. They have to work to earn an income to send back to their family. And there will be people, I guess, here, I don't know, I mean, only been here a couple of years, but I'm guessing the same might be true here. There might be families who live here in Malaysia and who are working every hour they possibly can to send money back home, wherever home might be. And maybe that's where their family is. Yeah. All right. Well done. Very good question. Good man. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more personal for you, perhaps, but also for the labour market, and it helps us to answer some of those other bit more sticky questions, okay, about the labour market, like why does this person earn more than that? Well, part of it is that productivity idea. Part of it is that ability to be really unique, really individually qualified in one particular field or many particular fields, but you are the person. So the more unique and specialist your skill is, okay, the more your supply curve is going to be inelastic. Okay? And similarly here, the less unique and less specialized, less skilled, perhaps, your workforce is, then the more elastic the curve will be. Right? Now, you can take that to an obvious extent here where they are perfectly elastic, which means that they're very unique. That supply of labour is absolutely unique, and you have to pay whatever the price for that. Right? But here you can see, right, that there are going to be differences in the wages able to be earned based on just the level of elasticity of the supply curves. So a more elastic supply curve is going to suggest that the wages are lower because they're more able to increase the quantity with very little increase in wage. Whereas when the labour supply is more inelastic, right, to increase the quantity is actually going to cost them higher in the form of wages, right? Because the people are more expensive. They perhaps are more productive, they might be more qualified, they might be more skilled. Whatever the requirement is, there's less of them, potentially, and so you need to pay more for them. So this kind of explains why there can be different labour markets, right, for different occupations. Why is it that a street cleaner would be paid less than a cardiothoracic surgeon? Yeah, because there's fewer of them, they've got more skills, more qualifications, all of those sorts of ideas. Whereas, I can drive the truck, sweep the streets. Do you have those here? I don't think you do. I used to see them quite a lot where we lived in China again. Big trucks with big brushes on the bottom of them, and they drove along the ground and then swept the streets, cleaning them of all dust and silt and the like. Now, when you marry up the supply curve with the demand curve, you're going to create your labour market. And again, it's that idea about elasticity. So you can see here the wages for somebody who might work, say, in the fast food industry might be a considerable amount lower than the wages that might be here for they say brain surgeon, okay, or say brain surgeon, all right, or cardiothoracic surgeon, astronaut, all right. That idea of different skill sets causing the wages for those two different occupations to be quite different is an important one. You can be asked actual exam questions, either multiple choice, which is good because it gives you the answer, or in paper 2, extended response, in which case you might even need to draw the diagrams to explain why it is that, say, a cleaner might earn less than a professional athlete. Yeah? Now, again, this image you can clip out of the slides and whack that into your notes because it actually explains it really well, and that will be a very useful thing for you to do. How am I going to time this? All right. Okay. Now, it brings us to the question of why. Why does this person earn more than this person? It brings us to that. So yes, we've discovered some of it already. We've talked about the idea about the elasticities, about the skill level, about productivity, all of that. So that can come under here, the idea of a skilled worker versus an unskilled worker. We could also talk about an experienced worker versus an inexperienced worker, and that might be where you come in. Okay, so when you are first into the workforce, you are younger, I've never done this job before, there are other people who've done it before, they're older, they're experienced, yeah, they might get paid more. Okay. Moving down, it might be qualified versus unqualified. You kind of want your doctors to have the qualification when they're operating on you, yeah. So that idea that they have the qualification, so perhaps they should be paid more than the ones who don't have the qualification. Gender. Maybe, yeah. If you have a look again at professional sports, the WNBA versus the NBA, okay? You have a look at the actors and the actors in the movies to understand that the male actors tend to get paid more than the female actors. Yeah? What is the difference with that? And there are movements to change all of that, but maybe that is an explainer. Yeah? There is another word, excuse me, that we can use. It's quite a long word beginning with the letter D. And it isn't, it is there. There it is. It's that one. Discrimination. Now, quite often learners will jump immediately to that word. Now, it might not be the case. It might be some of these other ones as well, yeah, or instead. But the idea of discrimination does occur. It is. Sometimes it can be very subtle. It can be that idea of stereotyping within a workforce. So I'll give you an example. A very, very long time ago, like nearly 20 years ago, one of the schools I was teaching at, one of the guys I was teaching with, he applied for a job at another school, okay? And he went to the interview. The interview went really well. He was being shown around the school, bit of a tour. This is where this happens, this is where this happens. And along the tour guide, who was the person who'd been interviewing him, said to him, well, you'll notice, it was a maths teacher's job, by the way, you'll notice that there are no female maths teachers here. He hadn't noticed, which says something about his powers of observation. And at which point the interviewer said, well, that's because women can't teach maths. Right? And he was a bit taken aback by that. Right? He didn't actually accept the job. He stayed with the school that we were at. But that's that idea. There is a stereotype involved, and therefore immediately if any CVs come in, no, maybe let's look at this one. And it could be something subtle that you may not even be aware of, okay? Some people in their CVs, they put the country that they were born in. Oh, no, these people are from New Zealand. No, put them in that pile, yeah? It could be, excuse me, it could be something as simple as that you put down your gender, and then you've put your age. Now that can be a problem, excuse me, goodness, because if you are a female and you are younger and you've put that in there, then one of the questions that they're going to be asking you is about whether you're married or not. And that can be a problem because then it is a question about whether you are planning on having a family, right? Because then you might take time out of the workforce. They might need to hire someone to replace you and train them up and the additional costs, etc. of that. So they might actually just immediately discount you, put them in the no pile just based on gender or gender and age, no pile. All right? So yes, that does happen. It absolutely does. There was an employer that we knew that as soon as the word South Africa came up on their CVs, they just put them straight in the no pile because they had had experience with people from South Africa and said, we don't like them. And that was their call, right? So they did, no, right? That kind of stereotyping, that kind of idea lends itself to discrimination. Yeah? We had another case. I'll give you another example. A little bit more straightforward, this one. We were looking at hiring another economics teacher at the school I was teaching at in New Zealand. Again, long time ago. All of the people involved aren't there anymore. Okay? Very, very long time ago. And we had all these applicants and one really stood out. And she was awesome. She'd had a good CV. She'd done really well. And she was younger, so that meant that we would be able to have her for a longer period of time in the school. And it was something we were interested in, right? Because we were all getting older at that point, right? So we were looking at hiring this particular person. Now, the process there was my line manager and I would interview the person, and then if we were happy with them, then we would interview them jointly with the principal, the head of the school. And that's where we were at. We'd interviewed them, we were happy with them, and so we were then going to take them to see the principal of the school. That arrived, and unbeknownst to us, that this particular woman had decided that one of the things that she wanted to do was to get a nose ring, right? So she had a little piece of jewelry stuck in her nose. Okay? Now, the school we were at was very, right, here's a box, you fit in it. Okay? If you don't fit in this box, right, shirt, tie, collar, jacket, trousers, shoes, everything in the box. Okay? And nose jewellery was definitely not in the box. The principal refused to see it. No, not even wanting to interview at all, which we were quite taken aback by, but she's a good applicant. But that idea of discrimination, that idea of stereotyping, that played into it. We met her later and we had to have an honest conversation with her about the box, right? And about the idea that that nose jewellery just isn't going to work. So could she try again and not have the nose jewellery? So she came back another time and the principal saw her through the window and she didn't have the nose jewellery, but he remembered to the time when she did have the nose jewellery and sure enough, refused to see her again. So that's how some business practices do work, yeah? And again, that was a long time ago and we hope that employers are much less discriminatory, but you know, I can't guarantee that, right? But yes, that could have an impact on your earnings. You just can't get those jobs because of X, Y, or Z reason. One of the guys who we ended up working with, this was the guy we ended up hiring, by the way. His name was Jacques, and he liked his name. He was passionate about his name. The reason why he was passionate about his name was because when it was written on a CV, people would immediately assume that he might be French or have some sort of French background. He didn't. He was actually South African. But his name sounded French, and so people would assume that he wasn't South African, and therefore they'd be more likely to hire him. So, okay. There's a difference between the public and the private sector. Now, this is, again, something that we've talked about with regards to what the public sector is. That's the one that's the government-owned. The private sector, that's owned by private businesses. So when you're talking about income levels, the assumption, and it is not always right, but the assumption is that if you're working with the government, you might actually earn less income than if you're working in the private sector with the private businesses, okay? If you're working as one of the top analysts at Amazon, you're going to be earning quite a bit of money. But if you're working as an analyst in the government, in their think tank, right, you're not going to be earning as much. So the suggestion being here is that because the government is concerned about their budget, they're not earning lots of revenue. Revenues are earned from taxation, etc. Whereas the private sector, they can sell lots of things and earn lots of revenue. Therefore, they're prepared to and happy to pay big amounts of money. New Zealand had this issue a while, goodness me, a long time ago with regards to people flying aeroplanes, because the main airline was owned by the government. And, no, not at the time, it was a private airline, apologies. And one of the problems that they had was the government would train up people for the New Zealand Air Force, flying planes, and then they would leave the Air Force and go into the private sector as a commercial pilot because they would earn 3 or 4 times as much money as they would if they were flying in the Air Force. Eventually, New Zealand decided we can't have an Air Force, so they just got rid of it. Differences between the industrial sectors, right? So think about farming versus manufacturing. There would be, you would expect there to be, because of the difference in skills, the demand for the workers, the productivity levels needed, you would expect to see some difference in incomes or earnings able to be earned by those two different professions. And likewise here, that very last one, this is what I hinted at before. If you are specific in your skill set, if you have a very unique talent, if you are the best in the world at, in theory, you should be able to command a higher wage because you are unique. You've got basically a perfectly inelastic supply curve of labor. Okay, that's it. You're the number one person, and that's part of your training. That's part of why you're at school. That's part of why we give you qualifications so that you can stand out from other people, right? And then you're going to go on and get more qualifications and more, and then you become even more unique. You do extra activities, you do service-based things, you join this club and that club, you're in the Model United Nations, you'll become a prefect, and all of those sorts of things, make you unique, make you stand out. So the idea being is that the more unique you are, potentially the higher pay you might receive. Yeah, that's kind of how that idea works. And if you do look at, as said, the movie stars, the professional athletes, all of those individuals, you will see that's what happens with them. Because they are potentially unique, specialist, they can get paid a lot of money. Here we go, classic example. You'll be familiar with the character potentially of Iron Man, at least my son is, hugely, right? Well, you will be aware that Robert Downey Jr., the actor who played Iron Man, okay, the very first movie was a big risk. Okay, he was relatively, well, he wasn't unknown, but it wasn't a sure thing that he was going to be good at that particular role. It also wasn't sure that people were going to enjoy the movie, that they were going to want to go to see it and pay the money to go and see it. Okay, so it ended up being very successful, and he ended up getting paid a lot of money for it. And then he's gone on to star as that same character in a number of other movies, some of which haven't been his movies, they've been other people's movies, but he has just appeared in them. So the one that was in the news the other day was the Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Homecoming. And in that movie, Robert Downey Jr., if you added up all of the time that he spent in that movie, he was actually on screen for 8 minutes. Now, that's quite a short amount of time in the sort of the running time of the movie. But he ended up being paid $10 million for that 8-minute screen time. Now, obviously, it would have taken them longer than 8 minutes to film his 8 minutes of screen time, but still, that's a lot of money for 8 minutes of output. Yeah, in fact, you could work it out on a per second basis, and it would be a ridiculously large amount of money. And you might argue the same about the professional sports people who earn hundreds of millions of dollars, but they are playing their sport over a longer, more significant period of time. Yeah. So that idea of uniqueness, that can also have an impact on wages. So all of those things, whether it's skills, experience, qualifications, maybe gender, maybe discrimination, public versus private sector, differences between the industrial sector, and the idea of special skills, all of those can be asked for you to explain them, or any one of them can be asked for you to explain. Why does this lead to a difference in wages? Or it could be a case study. Okay, so it could be a case study of a farmer and an industrial chemist. Why is there a difference in their wages? Okay, explain. Yeah, okay, that's what we're thinking there. Right, now, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do is we're going to stop there, okay, for the day. What I would like you to do, please, as your tasks is to review this. Now, the next time that we meet is tomorrow. And tomorrow there's going to be some additional tasks, etc., for you to work on. That will be very good for you to have a go at. Please review this material in advance of that. Okay. Otherwise, as we'd say in the land of my birth, you can have a bit of a brain break before your next lesson. All right. So we say in the land of my birth, he kōrera, which means goodbye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. David.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Still here, Lancelot.